Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is November the 9th, 2015. The show is being pre-recorded on November the 8th, 2015. So please bear that in mind as you listen tonight, that things can change abruptly in 24 hours. Regardless, I'd like to encourage you to catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on ucy.tv. And you can access the show's personal webpage, ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And again, I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. We're going to talk a lot about Syria tonight and the Middle East and geopolitics. We're going to try to touch on some other subjects if we have time. Those of you know there was a period of about 2 weeks where I was unavailable and not on the air, so some of this information is going to be somewhat old, but I'm going to go over it nonetheless because I feel it's important to try to catch up the listening audience on what's transpired, despite the fact that we are consistently entering into a time of grave danger in the Middle East in terms of the reverberations it could have for us here in the United States and any individual in Europe and Russia who may be listening to the show as well. This has very far-reaching consequences for what's happening. But before we get into that, I want to remind everyone that you can catch my work at activistpost.com, naturalblaze.com, theantimedia.org, number of other websites. But if you're interested in my work specifically, then please go to my website, brandonturbeville.com. And that is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all the archive versions of this show. All of the relevant material that I've been involved in will be posted there. There's an events page if you want to keep track of my speaking engagements. There is a books tab that's available there if you want to buy the books. And there is a store, which we're going to work on a little more in the future to build up that store. So keep going to brandonturbeville.com. Follow my work as it comes out. All of my work is there, but that's sort of the hub of what I do. Now, I mentioned that because of some logistical issues with the books that they're not on Amazon right now, but they're going to be shortly. Well, we've got the first one up on Amazon. The Difference It Makes, 36 Reasons Hillary Clinton Should Never Be President. That's available on Amazon right now for $9.99. It's a new book. And, of course, there's a number of ways you can get it. If you still want to go through the independent book printing company, thebookpatch.com is where you want to go, but it's going to be more expensive, and it's going to have a handling fee and all that kind of stuff. But if you go to Amazon, it's going to be just like buying anything else on Amazon. Just buy the book, have it shipped, and that's it. So that book is available on Amazon. You can also get it in Kindle version for 99 cents. And you can go to my website, brandonturbeville.com, and download the book for free. It's right there at the top right-hand corner of the page, and you can just download it and read it for free in a PDF or a Word file. Doesn't matter. It's up to you. And there you are. It's right there for free. Lest anyone claim that I'm in this for the money. Anyway, so we want to mention one other thing. If you are a listener, and I mentioned before, about several weeks ago, that we were going to have a call to action. This isn't necessarily the call to action. This is not the call to action. But I wanted to mention this nevertheless. If you are a listener who is a writer, then please contact me. We have some unpaid available writing positions available here, particularly if you're writing about natural health. So just contact me if you're looking to write, if you know a good bit about natural health and you can research and you can write articles, and you're also not in this for the money and you want to do this because you want to help change the world and help people learn more about natural health and so forth, then contact me. You can find my website at my email at brandonturbeville.com, but it's anticodex@yahoo.com, ANTICODEX @yahoo.com. Send me an email, and I will hook you up with the relevant website that wants to post your articles. And again, this is not a financial transaction. This is something that if you want to do for as a labor of love, then we can hook you up with a platform. So please just send me an email. But there will be a call to action in the near future, but I unfortunately was waylaid a couple of weeks ago and detained, so we were a little bit behind. So that's why we're going to get into some of the information that should have been covered a couple of weeks ago, but we want to do this for the sake of diligence. Now, the situation in the Middle East, I want to point out this is not related to the hospital that the United States bombed in Afghanistan, and it's not related to the alleged hospitals that Russia bombed. Remember, the United States bombed the hospital in Afghanistan, and immediately the day after, the headlines read that Russia had bombed a hospital in Syria, and then Russia had bombed 3 hospitals in Syria, and it was 6 hospitals, and then it was 9 hospitals, and they finally settled on 11 hospitals that Russia had bombed in Syria. Of course, all of that information about the hospitals that had been bombed by Russia, all of that information had come by Western-backed NGOs connected heavily to the National Endowment for Democracy and heavily to the U.S. State Department. So hardly independent information there. And in fact, Russia has released more footage. The Syrian government, I believe, has released more footage of one of the hospitals that Russia was supposedly had bombed and targeted and destroyed, and it's still there. After they had allegedly destroyed this hospital, it's still there. And the State Department has yet to answer that. Now they're saying, oh, we didn't say Russia blew it up. We said they're targeting it. Well, if they're targeting it, what do they miss? What happened here? You know, the building is still there, and there's no damage to it. Now the others, again, these NGOs that have reported, a lot of these guys don't even have hospitals in the areas that they said the hospitals were located. They said that they were destroyed. Well, they didn't even have hospitals there. But that's another story. I want to get into that. I mean, I think the idea that Russia has bombed these hospitals has been thoroughly debunked. So we're not going to get into that right now. I wanted to take you back to early October, where we had George Soros's NGO organizations using fake photos to blame Russia for more dead civilians. It's not really a surprise. We've seen this over and over. Remember, there's this group called the White Helmets. They are decidedly anti-Assad and pro-rebel, pro-terrorist, pro-al-Nusra. They recently released pictures on their Twitter account, and this is recently, I mean early October, and they were claiming to show the aftermath of a Russian bombing campaign against ISIS and other terrorists that was launched on September the 30th. And the tweet read, Russia strikes in Homs today, 33 civilians killed, including 3 children and 1 Syrian civil defense volunteer. That was the caption. And so this picture shows a bleeding little girl being held by a civil defense volunteer, and the caption claims that the child was injured along with a number of other civilians. The problem is that Twitter users immediately recognized what the photos were, and they called them out on it. The photos were actually a fraud because the pictures were taken 5 days prior to September 30th. They were taken on September 25th, and so it was not the incident they claimed it was. It was an attempt to assist in drumming up opposition to Putin and to Russia's attack on the jihadists in Syria. And it's funny that they also managed to tweet about how bad and awful the Russian airstrikes were hours before Russia's parliament even granted Putin the authority to use the Air Force in Syria. So the White Helmets organization is linked to George Soros through a PR firm named Purpose Incorporated. Purpose Incorporated is a pro-war firm that argues for Western intervention, I guess we should say, against Assad. The co-founder of Purpose Incorporated is Jeremy Hymans, who's also a founder of Avaz, which is a pro-democracy group, read pro-terrorist group, pro-destabilization group that's connected to George Soros and his Open Society Foundation, also to MoveOn.org, also to SEIU, the union there, SEIU. So we've got reports coming from Rick Sterling of the Dissident Voice. He writes that the white helmets were actually formed by the U.S. and the U.K. in 2013 and originally called Syrian Civil Defense. And I think he shows some evidence that to back that up. Basically, civilians from rebel-controlled territory in Syria were paid to go to Turkey to receive some training in rescue operations, and that program was managed by James Lemessurier, a former British soldier and private contractor whose contracting company was based in Dubai. Apparently the white helmets work primarily with Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, and the video of the recent alleged chlorine gas attacks start with the with the white helmet logo, and it continues. After the white helmet logo, it continues with the logo of al-Nusra. So basically, White Helmets is a small rescue team that's been designed to help al-Nusra. It's the rescue operation for al-Nusra. So it's by no means the first time an NGO has faked or used fake photographs to drum up support for Western military action in Syria or to demonize Assad and the Syrian government. Remember, earlier this year, on February 25th, we had Human Rights Watch, the famed human rights organization that can do no wrong in the eyes of left liberal mushheads. But Human Rights Watch posted a photo of a devastated civilian area in Syria, and it had the tagline, "Syria dropped barrel bombs despite ban." Now, of course, the ban that Human Rights Watch is referring to is the ban on bombing civilian areas that applies to both sides in Aleppo after the United Nations stepped in to save the terrorists from annihilation. Assad's forces had surrounded the city. Basically, they cut off a major supply route for the death squads coming from Turkey, and it had made the elimination of the jihadists in the area a virtual inevitability. But this was not to be, because the United Nations and Human Rights Watch stepped in. So on the day before, there was Human Rights Watch claimed that the Syrian government had dropped barrel bombs on hundreds of sites in rebel-held towns and cities in the past year, and then they had flouted a United Nations Security Council measure. The group, Human Rights Watch, it said it had relied on satellite images of photos, of videos, witness statements, etc. to conclude that the Syrian government had bombarded around 450 sites in and around the town of Dara, which is in the southern part of Syria, near the Israeli-Palestinian-Syrian border. And they had bombed about 1,000 sites in Aleppo in the north. And so they went from this period since February 22nd, 2014, when the Security Council specifically condemned the use of barrel bombs, which are basically large containers filled with explosives and projectiles that can just spread out and when they explode. But there's a problem with Human Rights Watch's tweet. Again, remember, the photograph the organization provided was not Aleppo. These photographs were showing a really extremely devastated area of Aleppo, and it was to show what the barrel bombs had done. But it was not Aleppo. The damage that had been brought upon the civilian area in the photograph that Human Rights Watch tweeted was not the result of Syrian military action. It was a result of military action by the United States. The photo was actually a picture of Kobane. That's Ain al-Arab. Remember, the city which had been the site of heavy U.S. aerial bombardment over the last several months. And it was particularly heavily bombed when the United States was engaged in this program of death squad herding and geographical reformation of sovereign Syrian and Iraqi territory. That was what was in the photo, but they used it as an example and photographic evidence to beat up on Assad. So they were using the destruction of Kobane or Ain al-Arab as a reason to condemn Assad and continue to promote the cause for U.S. military action in Syria. They were much less interested in the same exact destruction wrought by U.S. forces, so no condemnation of the United States. In other words, if Assad forces bomb a civilian area into the Stone Age, it's an atrocity, it's a war crime, it justifies international military involvement. If the United States bombs a civilian area into the Stone Age, it's no biggie, basically. Now, remember, Human Rights Watch is partially funded by George Soros, and Human Rights Watch itself has repeatedly shielded for NATO and America's imperialist aims, particularly in Syria. For instance, when Western media propaganda had reached a crescendo regarding the outright lie that Assad had used chemical weapons against his own people, Human Rights Watch stood right beside Obama and John Kerry, Skull and Bones John Kerry, in their effort to prove Assad's guilt. Remember, Human Rights Watch even went so far as to repeat the lie that the UN report suggested that Assad was the offending party. And that should have driven the final nail into any credibility that Human Rights Watch ever had. These guys read UN reports all the time. There is no mistake that that report did not say that at all. And that means that Human Rights Watch clearly lied through their teeth. Now, when a last-minute chemical weapons deal was secured by Russia in an effort to avoid another United States NATO invasion of a country in the Middle East, and then the ensuing chaos and destruction and rape and pillage and absolute hell that would be rained down upon more innocent people because of the behavior and the psychosis of the United States and NATO, Human Rights Watch did not rejoice for the opportunity of peaceful destruction of chemical weapons and war avoidance. It actually attacked the deal and claimed that it was a failure to ensure justice. Now, the deal did fail to ensure justice. There was no provisions demanding punishment of the death squads who actually used the weapons. Right? They didn't go in and they didn't slaughter these jihadist monkeys who were beheading and raping their way across Syria. No punishment for them. There was no punishment for the United States. There was no punishment for NATO countries that had initiated and controlled the jihadists to begin with. None of that. Remember, Human Rights Watch, remember Mother Agnes Miriam of the Cross, she had released her report that refuted what the United States and NATO were asserting in regards to the chemical weapons in Syria, and Human Rights Watch went out and attacked this woman over and over and over again. It was a relentless attack against this woman, a nun with the church, who simply gave documented evidence that these chemical weapons attacks were a fraud and that were committed by the Syrian death squads, not by the Syrian military. We can go back as far as 2009. Remember, Human Rights Watch was showing its true colors. It apparently signed off on and supported renditions. This is Human Rights Watch, remember. These are the people who bitch about human rights violations, about the death penalty, and we're opposed to the death penalty for sure. But the Human Rights Watch organization has no problem with renditions, has no problem kidnapping people off the street without any due process and then rendering them to jails and prisons in other countries where they're tortured. And there's no problem with that, huh? Human Rights Watch agreed to that, agreed to support that in secret talks with the Obama administration. Perhaps they were looking for a Nobel Peace Prize themselves. The Human Rights Watch or White Helmets, if they ever had any credibility in terms of the question of actual human rights, and they didn't, and they don't, all that credibility has to have been lost by now. We cannot pay attention to what these fools have to say anymore. These White Helmets, these Human Rights Watch groups, they're nothing but pro-U.S., pro-NATO, pro-Nusra organizations. They act as a smokescreen for the continuation of violation of human rights across the world, unless those violations are committed by America's enemies. In that case, it's the biggest atrocity since the Holocaust, remember. So it's something to bear in mind as the United States runs across the world bombing hospitals and civilian areas. Now, since we are at the precipice of some type of major confrontation between two nuclear superpowers, I got into this a few weeks ago, and it has caused some consternation within the alternative media, some elements of the alternative media, that some people have to jump to one extreme or the other. So basically, you either have to support this stupid American destabilization against Syria, and I think people who do that are thoroughly discredited and should be dismissed out of hand. But we have this other element that simply rushes into the arms of other governments and other parts of the world, and it becomes members of the Vladimir Putin personality cult. And what we have to say here is that Russia, to be clear, has done nothing wrong in this in this scene, right? This Syrian crisis. Russia has acted completely in self-defense, completely within the elements of international law, completely in the best interests of the Syrian people, and in the best interest, we should say, of the Russian people in this context. Now, we have a lot of problems with things that Putin and the Russian government do in Russia, and we will speak out against them when we need to, but this issue, clearly Russia is in the right, and they are acting in self-defense. But that doesn't mean that we automatically have to give over our brains and all of our fortitude over to the Russian government. The goal here is to have a set of principles. Not really a goal. It's the ideal is if you have a set of principles and you judge those things that happen outside of that, outside of the world, outside in the world, based on your principles, and not simply what personality cult that you've joined today, because that's essentially a person with no moorings. You have to have your principles. You could judge all of those things by those principles. So basically, I wanted to mention 6 reasons why Russia cares so much about Syria. It's an article that I wrote because I want to point out that on the world stage, Vladimir Putin has not committed military assistance, troops, money, his reputation, the reputation of Russia. He's not committed these things simply because he was sitting home one day reading my website and then thought, oh my God, we have to help the Syrian people. That's not why this was done. Putin is acting with Assad because of enlightened mutual self-interest, and we support that, by the way. We support the use of enlightened mutual self-interest because that works for everybody. It's enlightened, so it's a positive nature. It works for everyone, and it doesn't bring other people into fights that they shouldn't be in. So there's a lot of lack of understanding in the alternative media regarding the Russian move, and it's somewhat more sophisticated, but still substantially lacking, even when compared to the mainstream. So we've got some in the alternative media who are just opposing the Russian involvement on the basis of not wanting to see any further escalation, right? So these people, they would say, I don't want to see any more bombing of Syria, whether it's Russian bombing, American bombing. I don't want to see any more further escalation. Well, your only other option is for Russia to step back and let America have its way with Syria, because there's going to be more bombing. The question is, where are the bombs going to be aimed at? And right now, if the United States has its way, the bombs would be aimed at Assad, at civilians, and it would be protecting jihadist fanatics on the ground. And then we would see the march over to Hezbollah. We would see the march to Iran. All of this would necessarily take place. Then we've got this other segment or sect in the alternative media who just heap lavish praise upon Putin and basically see him as the potential leader for the world, personality cults. And that's a dangerous situation, regardless of the pure motives of the individual at the center of worship. Now, you can't blame Putin for that. You can't blame him for the cult of personality worship. This is particularly a thing that happens throughout the general population, is that people need and want leaders, and they're willing to sacrifice their principles and their brains for those leaders. And it happens in the alternative media as well. When someone gets an opinion in their mind, it becomes like a religious belief. And when you attack that, or when you say that there's another side of the story, they get all upset, and they're willing to engage in some type of inquisition. But again, to the people who don't want to see any more bombing in Syria, you are essentially arguing for Russia to pull back and wait until it's entirely surrounded by the United States and NATO forces, and then you can say, oh, well, you can bomb in self-defense when you've got the entire world arrayed against you. You're arguing for Russia to ensure its own demise, and that's not an acceptable solution for Russia. It's not an acceptable solution for Syria. In fact, it's really kind of boneheaded to suggest such a thing. If you want to see the bombing stop in Syria, then it's not Russia you should be complaining about. It's the United States. Tell the United States to stop bombing in Syria. Tell the United States and Turkey and NATO and Britain and France and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Israel to stop supporting terrorists in Syria, and it'll stop. That plain and simple. Plain and simple, it'll stop. But again, we have to guard against personality cult as well, whether it's in the United States or Russia. So what I wanted to do was to go through the reasons. When I say enlightened mutual self-interest, I wanted to go through basically some reasons that Russia is so concerned with Syria. Why did Russia commit troops and equipment and reputation and money and honor all on the Syrian question? They didn't do so with Libya. If it was simply a question of morality and a question of whether or not people were being abused, or human rights, or national sovereignty, then Russia would have involved itself in Libya. It's the same situation here. But Russia didn't involve itself in Libya because Libya hadn't established connections and alliances with Russia to the extent that Assad has done. That was a mistake on Gaddafi's part, for one for which he is paid very dearly. The Syrians, however, have got this alliance system set up with the Russians, and that's one of the reasons you see the Russians involved now. But let's go through this. I've got 6 listed, maybe get to some more, and we're going to try to cover this as much as possible. One is the pipeline. The West has long desired a Qatari pipeline project that would have come from the oil fields of Qatar, and then it would have come up through, went through Saudi Arabia, then into Jordan, and then up to Syria, and then through Turkey, and then on to Europe. Now, obvious benefits for Qatar in that situation. It's a basic addition of another source of oil and gas for Europe, and that essentially is what this is about, right? Because the pipeline would have represented a substantial reduction in the amount of leverage that Russia currently holds over Europe. Today, Russia is the main provider of the majority of Europe's oil and gas. If the European Union decides to act too provocative in its eastern regions, like Ukraine or some other area of the Russian sphere of influence, then Russia has a trump card. They're able to turn off the oil and gas spigot, and it's going to get very dark and very cold in Europe very fast. So Europe would then be left with a few options in the short to medium term other than to come around to Russia's way of thinking, right? They can be cold and dark and deal with it. They can pay exorbitant amounts of oil and gas, and that's not going to work because the Europeans are strapped. Or they can just bend to Russia's will, and that's what they would probably have to do to avoid some kind of social unrest. So that's what the development of the Qatari pipeline would have done. It would have removed the trump card that Russia has over Europe, right? It would have brought a new source of gas into Europe so that the Russians were not the main provider anymore, and thus they couldn't crack the whip on Europe. Basically, it would have removed the trump card, right? They could just open the Qatari spigot, and that would make up for what was lost when the Russians cut the oil and gas off. And it also would have deprived Russia of a substantial amount of oil and gas related income and revenue. Now, Assad nixed the Qatari pipeline back in 2009, and instead he went in favor of the Iran-Iraq-Syria pipeline that would have seen oil and gas coming from Iran through Iraq and Syria and then on into Europe. That's not directly beneficial to Russia's oil company, Gazprom, but the pipeline is one that is owned and operated by a Russian ally. They're generally beholden to Russian support in the United Nations Security Council and military support when the American NATO war machine is focused on them. So the Russian leverage over Europe would largely still exist so long as the alliance between Russia and Iran holds out, and therefore that out provided by Qatar would have been prevented. So that's what all that is about with the pipelines. That's one reason that Russia is concerned here. There's another reason. There's a warm water port, and the quest for warm water ports has long played a major role in Russian foreign policy and Russian history. Russia already has a number of those ports. It has Sevastopol, it has Crimea now, and it has Tartus in Syria. Now, Tartus has been a major force behind Russian support of Assad and Syria throughout the crisis. And up until this point, the Russians only controlled a portion of the Tartus port, but recently, in concert with the Russian military involvement, Russia is now in control of virtually the entire port. The entirety of the Tartus port is probably one of the things that sweetened the deal in terms of clinching Russian involvement here. This is essentially that Assad said, yeah, if you come in, I'll give you the port. Probably a good idea. A lot of people are wondering whether or not Russia was able to squeeze this greater control out of the port out of Assad at a critical moment when Syria needed Russian help the most, and it's that might be true. And you know, one could scarcely blame Assad for agreeing to that deal. It's also worth mentioning that Russia now has an air base in Latakia, a port city in its own right. It's an air base, but that's a port city. So that exists now as well. Now, of course, strategic influence, that's something else. It plays a major role in the Russian decision. Syria has been in its sphere of influence for some time, in the Russian sphere of influence, but it's also acted as one of the last Russian outposts in the Middle East after the fall of the Soviet Union. Russia doesn't want to lose this asset, especially with its pipeline potential, its buffering qualities against Western aggression, and of course it has the warm water port, that issue. So a closer alliance with Syria portends a closer alliance with Iran. That's the last country on the chessboard to fall before the assault begins on Russia and China directly. Russia's alliance with Iran is a separate discussion, of course, but just suffice it to say that a greater alliance with Iran is to Russia's distinct advantage, and a close alliance with Syria facilitates that needed alliance with Iran. And its entrance into the fight against ISIS, Russia's basically solidified good relationships with Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Hezbollah. So that's very beneficial to them. We've also got to mention, remember the old adage back in the 1960s when the United States was pushing for an aggressive imperialist war in Asia, in Vietnam, it was the domino theory. Well, Russia is presumably aware of the strategy being used against it, meaning the attempt to chip away at all the nations that resist the dictates of the NATO power structure, and particularly areas of Russian alliance and influence around the world, particularly those areas. Once those areas are finished off, of course, the sights are going to be turned directly on Russia. So the creeping moves to gradually surround Russia can't go unnoticed, and they haven't gone unnoticed. Putin has made statements in the past. So if Syria falls, Hezbollah will fall, and Iran will be isolated. And once Iran falls, there's little else left beyond Russia itself. We're going to see, Putin knows this, of course, but we're going to see the increase of terrorism in Russian territories. We'll see a greater push east by NATO in Ukraine. In essence, Russia is attempting to prevent the dominoes from falling. It doesn't want Syria to fall, because if Syria falls, there goes Hezbollah, there goes Iran, and then we are on the Russian border. We've got, Georgia, we've got Azerbaijan, but I think more obvious, you'll start seeing terrorists being deployed into Russia for destabilization, terrorist attacks, and then open outright aggression by the NATO powers once the violence and destabilization has gotten out of control. Russia knows this. They're trying to prevent it. We're going to, hopefully, if we have time, we're going to get into that a little bit as well. Now, also, fighting terrorism abroad, we have to mention this. The use of Islamic fundamentalists as proxy fighters in Syria long ago raised the eyebrows of Russian leaders. That's because, for no other reason that a number of Chechen fighters were flocking to the Middle East in order to engage in jihad as well. The fear was not only that they would return to Russia and begin launching terror attacks at home, but that these terrorist networks that control both the Middle Eastern jihadists and the Chechen variety would begin directing their proxies to attack Russia inside Russia, meaning Chechnya in areas even further inside the country. With the constant threat of Western-backed Chechen fighters in Russia launching attacks inside the country in the forefront, Turkey and the puppet government of Ukraine recently collaborated in the creation of Muslim brigades to be used against Russia in Crimea and other areas surrounding or in Russia. So remember, we covered that here on this show. So Russia's attempting to fight ISIS abroad so they don't have to fight them at home, basically by destroying an organized structure that may exist in Syria and hopefully reducing the number of dupes and fanatics and psychopaths in absolute number and prevent them from coming home to Russia. Now, this is something else that's not really talked about as much, but there's the Turkish expansion question. Perhaps the most, not the most extensive threat by any means to Russia, but Turkey is attempting to spread its influence across the Middle East and Asia. And that is an area, a theater, if you will, that includes Russia as a target also. Turkey, as the listeners to this show will be well aware, has provided yeoman service in the agenda of NATO and the Anglo-Americans, but it's clear that megalomaniacs like Erdogan have pipe dreams of reestablishing the Ottoman Empire. We've discussed that. These dreams are delusions. It's not going to happen. Erdogan is not going to be the leader of the new Ottoman Empire. That's a joke, and he's just fooling himself. But that doesn't prevent him from becoming a dangerous player in this region, particularly a dangerous player to Russia. So the attempt to promote Uyghur terrorism in Asia, and we've covered that, Uyghur terrorism in and around Russia's Asian and Eurasian borders, Tatar terror in Crimea, all that's reason enough for Russia to attempt to crush Turkey's plan for Syria. Now, Russia's position is Syria, as I said earlier, it's without a doubt beneficial to the Syrian people. It should not be romanticized that the Russian government is simply sitting at home and watching the crisis unfold, but it is obviously beneficial. They're acting within international law. They've been invited in by the Syrian government. They are defending the Syrian people, regardless of what their motives might be. And we have to support this. Now, we can't conspiracy ourselves into inaction. I get a lot of people sending me emails and messages saying, don't you understand that Russia's a part of this too, that Putin's a part of this too, and that this is all a big setup for World War III? Yeah, we all know that this is going to be set up for World War III, but you can't conspiracy yourself into inaction. People who send these messages tend to be people who are, they have done a certain amount of research, and they've quit. They've given up because the world's become a scary place, and now they just hide in their bedrooms, and they don't say anything to anyone, and they don't do anything because they've already given up. Let me ask you, if you think that it's all sewed up, and it's all done, it's all a foregone conclusion, then why the hell are you writing me? What's the difference between arguing that, oh, well, you can't do anything about it because it's all a big stage play where the Russians are going to come in and the United States is going to come in and we're going to have World War III? What's the difference between that and some Christian telling me that you can't do anything to change the world because it's been written about in the Bible and it's all going to happen no matter what you do? Well, what's the difference? This is cynical. Now, I'm not saying that this isn't the case. Of course, there is a stage of which a lot of the stuff is being played out, but there's no predetermination. We reject the idea of predetermination. Things can change. We can influence things. We can stop things. We can change things, and the power to do so is and will always be within our hands. The question of whether or not people will do that, well, that may provide a more cynical, pessimistic answer. But the question of whether or not it's possible, it's always possible. But it's going to take people to get off of their asses and do something before it can ever change. So we're not going to sit around on our hands and whine and shiver in fear and avoid action simply because we've read a few books that have said that everything's sewed up, and because you can make money off of selling certain types of materials that play on those fears. So there we are. Now let's move on to other things. Since we're talking about Russia, I think it's incumbent upon us to talk a little bit about Brzezinski, and I think Brzezinski is very important here. He's sort of the leading anti-Russian figure of the Anglo-American establishment, certainly a big geopolitical chess player. He wrote an op-ed for the Financial Times and suggested that the United States should retaliate against Russia for its actions in Syria. Even going so far as to use military action to do that. He says the Russian involvement in Syria puts American credibility and global reputation at stake and suggests that a situation like that is intolerable. Brzezinski, he wrote that the Russian attacks against what he and the U.S. State Department have labeled as non-ISIS targets, meaning the relatively moderate rebels, the relatively moderate cannibals, and rebels backed by the United States, at best reflects what he says, quote, Russian military incompetence, end quote, and at worst signals, quote, evidence of a dangerous desire to highlight American political impotence, end quote. He also says this: in these rapidly unfolding circumstances, the U.S. has only one real option if it is to protect its wider stakes in the region, to convey to Moscow the demand that it cease and desist from military actions that directly affect American assets. But better still, Russia might be persuaded to act with the U.S. in seeking a wider accommodation to a regional problem that transcends the interests of a single state. He said that he believes Russia is engaged in a, quote, a new form of neo-colonial domination, and he offered up an assessment of the geopolitical situation. This is what he says, quote, China would doubtless prefer to stay on the sidelines. It might calculate that it will then be in a better position to pick up the pieces, but the regional chaos could easily spread northeastward, eventually engulfing Central and Northeastern Asia. Both Russia and then China could be adversely affected, but American interests and America's friends, not to mention regional stability, would also suffer. It is time, therefore, for strategic boldness, end quote. So, it's a strange kind of neo-colonial domination that sees the dominated country invite the dominator in for support, with the dominator incredibly resistant to doing so for years. So it's a hell of a neo-colonial domination. You were invited in against your own wishes, you refused to come in, and then they begged and begged and begged to get you to come in, and now you're some kind of neo-colonial dominator? That doesn't make any sense, Z-Big. It's incredibly hypocritical to suggest that Russia is the state actor representing a neo-colonial domination when the United States is the one that's marched its blood-drenched boots all across the globe for decades, slaughtering and draining and oppressing civilians that have been unfortunate enough just to have been born in a country with natural wealth or strategic positioning. The idea that U.S. credibility is on the line as a result of the Russian involvement is without question. It is on the line, and we're not going to deny that. Unfortunately for the United States, that ship has already sailed a long time ago, and what little shred of American credibility that was left is being eaten up by every sortie flown against ISIS by the Russian military. So it's quite amazing what one can accomplish when one bombs the actual terrorist organization it claims is the enemy, isn't it? The Russians have clearly demonstrated that either the United States military is not capable of fighting itself out of a wet paper bag, or that the U.S. government never wanted to fight ISIS to begin with. And I think we can look at the trail of destruction that the United States has left behind in its wake, and we can say that it's obviously the latter, that they don't want to fight ISIS. So there's that. Now, a little more about Brzezinski. Brzezinski, of course, the national security advisor to Jimmy Carter, the architect of al-Qaeda, one of the principal geopolitical foreign policy advisors to a number of different administrations, as well as the Obama administration. He's quite the important figure in geopolitics here. He's not just a talking head or an op-ed writer for the Financial Times, but and we often also wonder how long the Financial Times is going to be around with their ridiculous subscription policy. Why anybody would pay for that is beyond me, but that's another topic. The U.S. Geopolitical strategy at work today, if you want to look at where this comes from, part of what you need to look at is Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy, and its Geostrategic Imperatives. I'm going to read a little bit from it to you right now. It says, this is what Brzezinski has to say, quote, give me 1 second, I need to find this quote, but this is the book, remember, that Brzezinski uttered those famous lines that America is too democratic at home to be autocratic abroad. He says, this limits the use of America's power, especially its capacity for military intimidation. Never before has a populist democracy attained international supremacy. But the pursuit of power is not a goal that commands popular passion, except in conditions of a sudden threat or challenge to the public's sense of domestic well-being. That book was written in 1997, and in this book, Brzezinski laments the fact that the public would not support blatant imperialism unless they really believed the crusade to be in their own immediate self-interest. But only 4 years later, the public got that sudden threat or challenge to their sense of domestic well-being that he speaks about in the form of the 9/11 attacks. But the Grand Chessboard, which you can find online and get it for yourself, discusses a lot more than the lack of a desire to wage war by the general public without a perceived external threat. It discusses in detail various major players in the geopolitical game and the methods they have to achieve their goals of hegemony. So, in regards to Russia, Brzezinski laid out his plan in this book to see a fractured Russia, a nation that was drastically smaller in size, much weaker in terms of its governmental structure, basically a Russia incapable of opposing Anglo-American hegemony. This is what he says in the book. Given the enormous size and diversity of the country, a decentralized political system based on the free market would be more likely to unleash the creative potential of both the Russian people and the country's vast natural resources. In turn, such a more decentralized Russia would be less susceptible to imperial mobilization. So it makes it clear that the strategy towards Russia is one that involves the breakup of the country into three parts as loosely confederated and partially beholden to NATO-dominated Europe and blended with the other powers of Asia. This is what he says. A loosely confederated Russia, composed of a European Russia, a Siberian Republic, and a Far Eastern Republic, would also find it easier to cultivate closer economic relations with Europe, with the new states of Central Asia, and with the Orient, which would thereby accelerate Russia's own development. Each of the three confederated entities would also be more able to tap local creative potential, stifled for centuries by Moscow's heavy bureaucratic hand. End quote. So, Brzezinski sees China as the greater Asian region that, uniting under a loosely confederal system, effectively forming the world into a realm of what is essentially three main trading blocks, right, full of impotent states and third world fiefdoms. So Russia obviously is not going to allow itself to be destroyed and broken up into three parts for the benefit of world oligarchy and world hegemony. But his desires, Brzezinski's desires, are clearly the goals of the ruling elite, and a plan to make them a reality is now in motion, as we can see across the globe. Now, the statement that I made a second ago, I want to make it clear that we're not jumping on bandwagons here. when we say that we appreciate and support the Russian bombing of terrorists in Syria. But I also want to make it clear that we are well aware of the fact of the way the world oligarchical system has been set up, and that the fact that we have this overarching system of control that spans nations, that it's not simply an Anglo-American conspiracy and none other, but that there's been control over the Russian world as well, and that there is indeed a roadmap to world confrontation that unfortunately is being followed. But as I said earlier, I want to make it clear that we cannot simply conspiracy ourselves into inaction. We cannot simply accept this as a foregone conclusion and then start building bunkers and trying to hide away. This should be a situation that reminds us that it's time for action, because there is no predetermination. There is nothing that says this is set in stone and nothing can be done about it, and quite the opposite. We have the opportunity to go out and fight to try and change it. And will we win? Will we be able to change it? Well, that we don't know. But the opportunity is here, and we have to do what we can to stop it. So we have to be fully aware of the situation that we face and how deep the rabbit hole goes. And that is quite a daunting task, and a lot of people can't handle it, and they shrink away. But we have to be able to stand up to the challenges. We have to be able to understand what we are facing in order so that we may fight it, and so that we might be able to begin to mount a resistance and begin to plan on the new type of world that we want to build. We're coming up on a new year, and we should really be thinking about that heavily. Now, we've got a few minutes left, and I want to continue on with some of the issues. I want to maybe touch on some issues taking place still in Syria, and maybe one or two domestic ones if I can. Now, again, when we talk about the Russians bombing ISIS, we talk about the United States bombing in Syria. There's a tale of two bombings, right? The United States has again demonstrated its true position in regards to ISIS and the Russian bombing of the terrorists there in Syria, as Russian forces are dropping bombs and missiles on ISIS and other terrorists across Syria. They're shooting cruise missiles from the Caspian. They're regular sortie missions, combat helicopter attacks against ISIS and other relatively moderate cannibals and terrorists. The United States is launching a bombing mission of its own, but it's done so against civilian power stations. Remember, in mid-October, the United States bombed 2 power plants in Aleppo. The power plants were located in Al-Rudnaiya, east of Aleppo, and it resulted in the power outages affecting the Syrian people, which added to the American tradition of bombing civilian infrastructure instead of ISIS and other terrorist targets in Syria. The power outages only further contribute to the misery surrounding the people of Aleppo, who have been bombarded by barbarians funded by the United States and NATO, who are intent on raping and beheading their way through the city and declaring their caliphate of pre-civilization on civilized people. So it should be noted that the U.S. bombing campaign itself is a violation of international law, unlike the Russian campaign, where the Russian forces were invited into the country by the legitimate government of that country. The U.S. has long maintained that its bombing campaign was directed at ISIS, but to date, very little damage has ever been done to ISIS structures or their facilities or personnel by any American airstrikes. Only when ISIS fighters are threatening a Western interest, like an oil well owned by a Western company, or when NATO has been able to simply redirect ISIS forces via embedded or proxy commanders, do terrorists actually find themselves in danger. And that itself is not really danger as much as it is death squad herding elements. So the U.S. has repeatedly bombed oil refineries, bridges, grain silos, food distribution facilities, and other civilian infrastructure and civilian areas. The U.S. support of ISIS can scarcely be denied, given the fact that the U.S., in collusion with NATO and the GCC and Israel, were responsible for the creation of the terror group to begin with, as well as for inserting it into Syria for the purpose of destroying the secular government of Bashar al-Assad. So the American reaction, the governmental portion, to the Russian bombing campaign is telling. The U.S. State Department is panicking and throwing fits over the Russian bombing of terrorist targets, who even with the best PR money can only be described as relatively moderate. That's the best that we can describe it. I guess in relation to heart-eating cannibals and baby killers and perpetrators of some of the most grotesque murders ever witnessed, virtually anybody might be considered moderate, but none of the savages fighting against Assad in Syria are even moderate in comparison to that, since despite their presence in different brigades and different units of terror, complete with a bunch of different silly names, they're all part of the same overarching organization that is controlled and backed and funded and directed by the West. There were never any moderate rebels in Syria. There are certainly no relatively moderate rebels operating in Syria today. The Syrians recognize this. The Iranians and Hezbollah recognize this. The Russians recognize this. It is high time for the American people to join the reality-based community and recognize this as well. Now, just to touch on something here in the United States, if we have time, there is an effort to recall Senator Pan in California, and I don't know if I have time to really go through much of this, but the effort to repeal SB 277 in California has officially failed. That's possibly due to what a lot of people suggest have been a concerted act at sabotage or another repeal effort that was killed from the inside by some type of agent. But there's another repeal effort now. It's not targeted at the bill so much as it is targeted at Richard Pan, as California senator, one of the main sponsors of SB 277, and it's a grassroots fight by a number of California citizens who just find his corporate pandering and political corruption and violation of parental rights that is no longer tolerable. So the website is recallpan.com. That's RECALLPAN.com. As the movement made up a number of diverse individuals and groups that oppose Pan for very diverse reasons. All of them are united for the purpose of seeing this corporate senator removed from his position that he is so blatantly abused. Maybe we'll talk about this a little bit in the future at some point, because they've got some good things to say, and I think that the recallpan.com, the Recall Pan movement, is a good model because they include conservatives, they include liberals, they include conspiracy people, they include soccer moms, they include a number of different organizations, all for the same issue, all with a demand. So that's important, and we wish them well, and hopefully we'll talk about them soon. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.